Welcome to the Explainer. So today we're going to be looking at one of the most intimidating, yet honestly one of the most fascinating macroeconomic models out there, the ISLM model. If you've ever sat back and wondered exactly how economists map out the effects of government spending or how they predict what central bank interventions will do to the economy, well, this source material breaks it down beautifully. We're going to see exactly how all these moving parts interact. Right off the bat, let's just break down this famously intimidating acronym so we know exactly what gears make up this economic machine. IS stands for investment savings, and that represents the goods market. On the flip side, LM stands for liquidity preference money supply, which is what drives the money market. When you put them together, they give us this incredibly unified theory of how an economy operates in the short term. So here's our game plan for today. We're going to meet the model itself, break down both the IS and LM curves piece by piece so we don't get lost in the math, see what happens when we actually shift them around, and finally, we'll talk about where this model falls short in the real world. All right, part 1. Let's meet the master blueprint itself. So a little history. This model was developed way back in the 1930s by an economist named John Hicks, and he was basically building on Keynesian theory to map out short-run economic growth. This master blueprint is trying to answer one massive question. At what exact interest rate and at what level of national output are the product market and the money market in perfect simultaneous balance? It's designed for a closed economy, which basically just lets us focus purely on those internal gears without worrying about international trade. Moving right along to part 2, let's pop the hood and look at the first gear, the IS curve, which represents the goods market. Think of the IS curve as the exact place where economic leakages, like savings and taxes, perfectly match economic injections, like investment and government spending. Now, the key thing to remember here is that this curve slopes downward, and that totally makes sense when you think about actual human behavior. When borrowing is basically on sale because interest rates are super low, businesses naturally take out more loans to build factories and hire workers, right? And that pushes total national output upward. Basically, low interest equals high output. When we visualize this, you get that classic downward sloping curve, with the interest rate on the vertical axis and national output on the horizontal axis. Every single point along that downward slope represents a unique combination where the goods market is in perfect harmony. Okay, part 3. Let's look at the other half of our machine, the LM curve, representing the money market. Now, unlike the IS curve we just looked at, the LM curve slopes upward. Why? Well, think of it like this. As a person gets wealthier, they naturally demand more pocket change to go about their daily transactions. On a national scale, as income rises, people conduct more transactions and demand more cash. But that massive demand strains the fixed money supply provided by the central bank. And what happens when demand outweighs supply? It naturally forces up the price of holding money, which is the interest rate. So higher income equals higher interest rates. All right, part 4. This is where things get really fun. It's time to start pulling some levers and moving these curves. We basically have 2 main policy switches we can flip here. First, we have fiscal policy, which is controlled by the government through taxing and spending. That shifts our IS curve. And second, we have monetary policy, which is controlled by the central bank, altering the money supply. That shifts our LM curve. It's absolutely crucial to know who is controlling which curve. Let's picture fiscal policy in action. Imagine the government decides to inject a massive amount of spending into the economy. That causes the entire IS curve to shift outward, to the right. Economic output grows. Sounds great, right? But because the IS curve just slid up along that upward sloping LM curve, the equilibrium interest rate gets nudged higher too. And this brings us to a really fascinating plot twist known as crowding out. The government pumped money in, which successfully raised output, sure, but it also drove interest rates up. Suddenly, private businesses look at those high rates, find borrowing way too expensive, and they step back. So, by trying to stimulate the economy, the government accidentally crowded out private investment, which severely weakens the net gain of what they were trying to do in the first place. But this is exactly where the central bank can swoop in to the rescue with monetary policy. If they see interest rates climbing too high from that government spending, they can increase the money supply, which shifts the LM curve downwards. That drops the interest rate back down, making loans affordable for private businesses again, while giving economic output an additional massive boost. Now, like any complex machine, this one can break down if pushed to the extremes. Take the Keynesian liquidity trap. This is a scenario where interest rates are practically at zero, but fearful people are just hoarding cash anyway. The LM curve goes completely flat, horizontal. Monetary policy is literally useless here, but fiscal policy becomes highly effective with zero crowding out. Conversely, in what we call the classical extreme, the LM curve is perfectly vertical. In that world, government fiscal spending causes full crowding out, making monetary policy the only effective tool left in the box. Which brings us to our final section, pulling back the curtain on the flaws and the real-world value of this famous model. Let's be real, the model definitely has some fatal flaws when you try to apply it to the modern world, which is why it actually fell out of favor a bit in the 1970s. The absolute biggest flaw? It assumes prices are perfectly constant. It completely ignores inflation. So when the 1970s brought stagflation, which is stagnant growth combined with runaway inflation, the ISLM model was totally stumped. Plus, modern central banks today usually target interest rates directly, rather than strictly trying to control the raw supply of money. When you compare ISLM directly to something like the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, the missing piece becomes super obvious. The ADAS model adds a P for price level on the vertical axis. Because inflation is such a critical indicator today, economists just had to evolve past ISLM to dynamic models that actually factor in changing prices. ISLM is incredibly powerful for sure, but it's just one lens. But, despite those limitations, this model is absolutely not dead. I actually love this quote from an economics forum we found in the source material. ISLM is a great tool to build initial schematic intuition about the issue in question, even though its micro-foundations are not clear at all. Even if the deep micro-math is hotly debated, it still gives us this unparalleled foundation to visualize how government spending, money printing, and interest rates all push and pull against one another. So that leaves us with a pretty massive question to ponder. We just decoded a machine that was built in the 1930s for a completely different era. As we navigate a modern world defined by wild supply chain shocks, unpredictable inflation, and the rise of digital currencies, is the ISLM model still enough to guide us, or is it time to build an entirely new machine? Keep pulling those levers of curiosity, and we'll see you in the next explainer.